Hello, and welcome to the Group 8 podcast. Today, we'll be reviewing The Road by Cormac McCarthy. The book starts out with a father and a son in a cave in a post-apocalyptic world, wondering where they will go next. The story goes on as they move south to try to survive another winter, with many obstacles in their path. One of the most prominent themes of the story is morality and humanity. I thought this theme was really cool because it made you really question what you would do in these situations. One example of personification in the book is on page 57, when it is stated that death is not a lover. It really makes you think of death as an actual person in this story. Also, on page 83, an example of a hyperbole is given when the father says, "and nothing bad is going to happen," when obviously there will be something bad that happens. The characters are also pretty interesting.
Yeah, the characters have a couple of traits that make them quite unique. For example, on page 265, the father stays persistent even though he was at a huge disadvantage due to an injury. His motivation throughout the story is to keep his son alive, as seen on page 278. He also undergoes some change in the way he disciplines the boy, as he gives him more leeway in what he is allowed and not allowed to do. An example of this would be when the father lets the boy shoot a flare gun at the sea. There was also an example of a simile on page 28 when it says, "Then it passed beneath them like an underground train and drew into the night."
The boy has a unique trait to him as well. The boy shows sympathy to the world around him. Whenever he sees a wandering traveler, he always wants to take them in and care for them, like his father does on page 258. This leads to him maturing as a character and growing to have a big heart. There were also a couple of dystopian characteristics throughout the story. An example would be when it states barren, silent, godless. It tells the reader how sad and destroyed the world has become. Another example would be when the father says that they will find food because they always do. This shows us that the characters have a false sense of security in their society.
The people in the story are dehumanized when they are in a life or death situation. They do things that we would think are wrong and inhumane. An example of this would be on page 257 when a man steals the grocery cart with all the materials the father and son needed to survive. This book also has some quotes that I thought were amazing. On page 5, the father states, "If he is not the word of God, God never spoke." This quote is very powerful because it shows how much the father really values his son, and it also gives his character another level of depth. However, one thing I was too fond of was the pacing dragged on in some points.
Yeah, I can agree that the book dragged on, especially in the beginning of the story. The pace sort of picked up once the duo found a bunker full of food though. This event gave me a feeling of salvation. They were very close to starving to death, and it was like a breath of fresh air. What I couldn't understand was why they couldn't stay in the bunker for a much longer time. They seemed pretty safe in there, and they even had the gun in case if anything went wrong. This newfound world really gives the reader a very interesting setting to imagine, because it's not something you can really relate to. You just have to imagine yourself in the place of the father and son. I also sort of felt sympathy for the little boy, because all he wanted to do was help others even though he knew he couldn't.
Personally, I thought the book was interesting at some points, but it would get boring at times. I thought the whole setting being in a post-apocalyptic era is very interesting and definitely makes you think about what you do under these circumstances. The fact they had to survive all on their own looking for food and shelter gives you a feeling about appreciating what we have now. However, there was a lot of small talk and not a lot of emotion was shown between the two characters, so it basically doesn't give you that feeling of adrenaline or excitement.
I think the story had some pretty interesting scenes and settings. One scene that was pretty interesting was when the father got into an encounter and gets drastically slowed down. Personally, I think McCarthy did a great job creating an interesting world for his characters. The barren dystopian world really does make you think. Where the story really lost me is how he always just repeats his lines. Maybe he was trying to attempt at creating a realistic child, but I can't really see the magic in it. Overall, the book was pretty okay. I wasn't able to fall in love with the characters, but the world was pretty interesting, I guess.
I think we can all agree that the plot dragged on a little too much in some points. The characters weren't exactly the most interesting, but they had their moments. The overall story was good, but it could have improved in certain areas. Anyways, thank you for listening to our book review podcast for The Road by Cormac McCarthy.